The number one tip, if you'd want to bring your interview answers from good to great, would be to understand why those questions get asked in the first place. And I'd like to share with you a number of examples on this. The most common of them being the tell me about yourself. You see, some candidates genuinely believe that the reason their interviewer is asking you this because they did not read your CV, and therefore they perform a readout, even word for word, for their on their CV during that job interview. Right? When the core reason would be because they'd be interested in some highlights, what's interesting about you and what's in for them, also ideally, right? Also to build rapport and many other things. But what distinguishes here a decent example, when you give everything about you from a great answer, when you pitch the highlights of what's interesting about yourself. Okay, this was the simple stuff. Second example, if someone would ask you in a job interview, how do you learn? Okay, I can tell you a very common answer to this interview question is, hey, you know what, it's an easy one now with ChatGPT. I got everything I want. I even ask ChatGPT every day, and I learn using ChatGPT, right? Now, nobody's going to disqualify you because you learn using ChatGPT, but I can tell you if you want to bring your answers from good to great, and if you want to exhibit great learning skills, and all the great learners will tell you that they never only use one single source to learn. So one great behavior you do not sell yourself on would be you learn from multiple sources, right? So this would be a second example. The third example, a behavioral interview question. Tell me about the time you had to communicate a change in direction that you anticipated people would have concerns with. Right, so it's a pretty long interview question. You might also want to consider taking notes during your job interview, especially if the questions are long so you don't forget them. But why would they ask you such a question during your job interview? Many candidates would assume, especially old-fashioned managers would assume that the situation is one of a great tension where you have to push people, to deliver, so to speak, on the desired outcomes. When in fact, the core reason why I ask this would be your interpersonal skills, your ability to earn people's trust, because you anticipated that people would have concerns with, right? Leading without authority. This would be the core thing when answering such interview questions. Okay. Fourth example, I'd like to share with you a very classic one. Tell me about the time when you failed. I can tell you from experience, people who do not prepare job interviews and who hear this question for the first time will struggle explaining how they failed, but then they would change their mind and try to paint it in such a way that it was nothing serious, don't worry, it wasn't a proper failure. When in fact, the core reason why someone would ask you this in a job interview because they want to see what you learned, whether you had an interesting experience from which you learned many interesting things, right? I have more than a dozen, I think, videos into which I explain more on this topic, right? The fifth example, slightly counterintuitive interview question. What's the biggest misconception your coworkers have about you, and why do they have it? Why do they make that? Right? So a reactive way to answer this, the question is, what's the biggest misconception they have about you, would be to say something, hey, they're wrong about, what are they wrong about you? When in fact, the core reason why someone would ask you this question, the core reason would be to answer it in such a way that it's similar to what's your weakness. Okay, so you could pitch it with, hey, I think my coworkers would say I'm a bit quiet, but in fact, I think I'm a bit shy because I take a bit long, maybe at times, to come up with some decisions, so to speak. So you would sell it, hey, it's a weakness and I improve this. I'm trying to get better at this. Or on the other hand, you could say that, hey, my coworkers might say that at times I'm a bit direct, a bit assertive, for which, I'm also trying, to take a deep breath, so to speak, before getting into a discussion with anyone on a topic that might seem a little bit sensitive, right? So it was a bit counterintuitive to answer this one. Number sixth example I wanted to share with you. Tell me about the time when you lost your temper. Okay, so a majority of candidates would interpret this interview question as tell me about the time when you failed. Okay, when you lost your temper and failed at something, right? When in fact, if you think a little bit, if you read a little bit between the lines, it's not necessary that you talk necessarily about the time when you failed, you had a major failure, shortcoming, because this is a conflict story, actually, right? Lost your temper doesn't refer to your subject matter expertise, right? So you could give a perfectly fine interview answer without shooting yourself in the foot with a failure or risking it with a failure when compared to talking about a conflict situation, right? And the seventh example is one of my favorite ones, would be tell me about the time when you had a product, program or service which was already receiving good customer feedback, but you decided to do more. Okay, 80% of candidates would use an example of a time when something was working reasonably well, but they fixed some extra bugs without asking for money or without asking for any favors, when in fact the best possible way to answer this interview question would be something on the lines when you looked around the corner and found something that the customer didn't even know existed. You wowed your customers with your high standards in the work that you do versus the bug fixing approach, signaling, so qualitative standards in the type of work you do. Okay, so long story short, always focus in the job interview because there's always going to be a reason behind a core behavior, behind the questions you're getting asked. And this is key if you want to bring your answers from good to great. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.